Imagine pulling potato after potato out of the ground. Not 30, not 50, not 100, more than you can carry. And you have not touched a hose since planting. Not once. No irrigation line, no drip tape, no watering can, no well. Just seed, soil, and a system. The Irish peasantry used to feed an entire nation for 2 centuries before modern agriculture decided it knew better and erased it. That is not mythology. That is what lazy bed cultivation looked like on the hillsides of County Mayo and County Clare every harvest season from the 1600s through the families on Atlantic-facing slopes on rocky ground that would make a modern gardener give up before they started, producing 6 to 8 tons of potatoes per acre, without a single irrigation tool of any kind. What you are about to learn is the exact system they used, the geometry, the soil logic, the timing, and the biological mechanism that every modern growing guide ignores entirely. Stay with me until the end, because the last piece of this system I found buried in a 1904 government survey from County Mayo, a practice that a visiting surveyor dismissed peasant superstition, turns out to be one of the most sophisticated soil interventions ever documented in potato cultivation history. I have never seen it mentioned in any modern gardening video, any permaculture guide, or any growing tutorial online. And it is the reason their yields were double what we produce today with every advantage they did not have. Drop a comment right now and tell me, are you growing potatoes this season? Or did a bad harvest bring you here? I want to know where in the world someone's potato growing is about to change forever. What if the most effective potato cultivation system ever developed was already perfected 300 years ago? And the only reason you have never heard of it is because an entire industry profits from you not knowing it. The lazy bed system does not require a single product that a garden center sells. No drip irrigation kit, no raised bed lumber, no soil conditioner, no slow-release fertilizer, nothing. The moment this system becomes mainstream knowledge, a category of garden retail becomes unnecessary. And so the lazy bed gets quietly reframed, described in history books as a relic of poverty and desperation, a primitive workaround used by people with nothing. That framing is the most profitable lie in modern horticulture, because the evidence shows something completely different. In 1780, an Anglo-Irish agricultural surveyor named Arthur Young traveled the length of Ireland documenting farming practices. He recorded his findings in a document called Tour in Ireland, which still sits in the National Library of Ireland today. What Young found in the west of the country stopped him. He described long, raised ridges of soil, typically 4 to 6 feet wide, running in parallel across fields, hillsides, even boggy ground that no English farmer would have attempted to cultivate. Between each ridge, a trench. He documented yields of 6 to 8 tons per acre from these systems on ground that should, by every conventional agricultural logic of his era, have been producing nothing. Agricultural historians at University College Cork, who have studied pre-famine farming records in detail, have described the lazy bed as one of the most sophisticated dry cultivation systems ever developed by a pre-industrial farming culture. Not a crude workaround. A system, refined over generations, built around a precise understanding of how water, soil, temperature, and plant physiology interact. An understanding those farmers expressed not in scientific language, but in the geometry of the land they shaped with a spade. And here is the part that is going to stop you cold, because every other video about the lazy bed shows you a picture of raised ridges and then moves on to something else. They show you the shape. They never explain why the shape works. And the why is the entire secret. A standard flat potato bed sits at ground level. When it rains, water runs across the surface, some soaks in, the rest runs off. The root zone receives moisture inconsistently. Between rains, the surface dries. Capillary action pulls subsurface moisture upward and evaporates it from the top of the soil, and you compensate with irrigation. You are perpetually chasing moisture from above, because your growing system has no mechanism to hold it from below. The lazy bed geometry breaks this cycle in 3 ways simultaneously, and all 3 operate without any input from you. First, elevation. The raised ridge sits above the water table fluctuation zone. After heavy rain, water drains immediately into the flanking trenches and away from the root zone. Modern flatbed gardeners lose between 15 and 30% of their potato crop to water-related disease in wet summers, primarily because roots sit in saturated soil long enough for Phytophthora and Fusarium to take hold. The Irish, farming in one of the wettest climates in Europe, were losing virtually nothing to root rot in normal rainfall years. The geometry prevented the condition before it could develop. Second, trench-to-ridge moisture transfer. The drainage trenches between beds do not simply remove excess water. They create a subsurface moisture gradient. Water held in the trench soil sits at a lower elevation than the root zone in the ridge above it. The ridge draws from that subsurface reservoir through capillary action, slowly, consistently, from below. The roots grow downward toward moisture, rather than waiting for moisture to arrive from above. This produces a fundamentally different root architecture, deeper, wider spreading, more drought-resilient than any plant grown in a conventionally irrigated flat bed. Third, and this is what no other video on this topic tells you, Charles Orser's agricultural archaeology work at Illinois State University, which documented lazy bed systems across multiple Irish counties, found evidence that the raised ridge geometry creates a consistent microclimate effect. The relatively warmer soil surface of the ridge, surrounded by the cooler air pooling in the trenches on either side, condenses atmospheric moisture onto the ridge surface every morning. In Ireland's Atlantic climate, dew deposition alone accounted for the equivalent of 1 to 2 inches of additional moisture per month during the growing season. That is not a side effect of the design. Orser's analysis suggests it was a refined feature of it, the product of generations of observation and adjustment. To build one yourself, mark out a strip 4 to 5 feet wide. Cut the sod from that strip in sections and set it aside. Using a spade, pull soil from a 12-inch trench on each side of your strip, throwing that soil up onto the center to create your ridge. The ridge should sit 10 to 14 inches above the surrounding ground when finished. Your seed potatoes go directly on the surface of that ridge. Then the sod you set aside goes back on top of them, grass side down, followed by a final layer of the trench soil over everything. The trench remains open on both sides. That open trench is not empty space. It is the drainage and moisture transfer engine that runs the entire system. But here is the part that every other video on potato growing gets completely wrong, and it starts before you ever place a seed. When you dig a trench and bury a seed potato in tilled soil, you compact the earth around it. Compacted soil has reduced pore space, reduced oxygen availability, and disrupted capillary function. The seed potato must push its initial root system through that compaction before it can establish. It spends energy fighting the soil structure in the first 2 weeks of growth, the most critical 2 weeks of the entire season. When a seed potato is placed on top of undisturbed ground and covered with inverted sod and mounded earth, it sits in a pocket of loose, oxygenated material resting directly above an intact living soil system. The worm channels are still open. The fungal networks are undisturbed. The seed potato's roots find immediate pathways downward through a soil that has not been broken. Establishment is faster. Canopy develops earlier. The plant enters its first earthing up cycle, already ahead of where a buried plant would be at the same calendar date. The inverted sod layer placed directly over the seed potato serves 2 additional functions that no modern guide mentions. As it decomposes across the growing seasons, it releases a slow, steady supply of nitrogen, timed naturally to coincide with the transition from vegetative growth to tuber initiation, which is precisely when nitrogen demand peaks. And the thermal mass of that sod layer insulates the seed level from late spring frosts, protecting emerging sprouts on nights when an exposed flat bed would take damage. The Irish were farming into April and May on Atlantic hillsides. That insulation was not incidental. It extended their effective planting window by 2 to 3 weeks. Now, here is where most people stop when they first hear about the lazy bed system. They think, fine, raised bed, undisturbed soil, I understand. But the real multiplication mechanism, the reason yields reached 15 to 25 tubers per plant, compared to the 6 to 10 you get in a conventional flatbed, is what happens after the plant emerges. And this is the section that separates a 30 potato harvest from a harvest you cannot carry out of the garden in one trip. A potato plant does not produce tubers from its roots. It produces them from stolons, horizontal stems that grow outward from the main stem underground. Every section of main stem that is buried beneath soil has the potential to generate stolons. Every stolon produces tubers. The relationship is direct and measurable. More buried stem length equals more stolon production sites equals more tubers at harvest. This is why earthing up exists. But what the Irish did with earthing up, the frequency and the precision of it, is something modern guides gesture at without ever fully explaining. Here is the exact progression. 3 weeks after your potato plants emerge above the ridge surface, typically when they reach 8 to 10 inches of above-ground height, you perform your first earthing up. Pull soil from the trenches onto the ridge, burying the lower 4 to 5 inches of stem. At this point, you have created an additional 4 to 5 inches of buried stem capable of producing stolons. B5 tuber initiation begins at these newly buried nodes within 7 to 10 days. Week 6 after emergence, your second earthing up. The plants are now 12 to 14 inches tall. You bury another 4 to 5 inches of stem. Buried stem total, 8 to 10 inches. Stolon sites multiplying. Week 9, your third earthing up. Plants approaching 18 to 20 inches. Another 4 to 5 inches of stem buried. Total buried stem now 12 to 15 inches. The trench on either side is visibly deepening as you pull material upward. The ridge is growing taller with each pass. Week 12. Your fourth and final earthing up before the canopy closes and access becomes difficult. Total buried stem at this point, 16 to 20 inches. At that column of buried stem, 16 to 20 inches of nodes, each capable of producing 3 to 5 stolons. Each stolon producing 2 to 4 tubers, is the direct, physical, measurable explanation for why lazy bed yields were double what flatbed cultivation produces. Not the variety, not the rainfall, not the soil fertility, the stem length. Every inch of additional buried stem is a yield multiplier. The Irish earthed up 4 times because 4 times produced more than 3 times and 3 times produced more than 2. They did not know the stolon physiology. They knew the result, and they systematized the result across generations. But even that is not what stopped me cold when I went deep into the historical record. In 1904, the Congested Districts Board for Ireland, a government body established to document and address rural poverty in the west of the country, commissioned a survey of surviving agricultural practices in counties Galway, Mayo, and Donegal. The survey included direct accounts from smallholders who had maintained lazy bed systems on their land for 3 and 4 generations without interruption. One passage, recorded by a surveyor working in the Erris district of County Mayo, describes a practice he had observed on multiple farms and could not account for. He called the second sod turning. It was performed not at planting, but at the moment the potato plants reached approximately 8 inches of above-ground growth, right at the point of the first earthing up. At that moment, the farmer would take sod cut from the edge of the field, specifically from the field margin, where grass had grown undisturbed for years, and press sections of it, grass root side down, against the base of each emerging plant before mounding the first layer of earth. Not compost, not manure, not loosened soil, sod, with the root system intact and the soil around those roots undisturbed. The surveyor noted that he could not determine the agronomic purpose of this practice. He described it, in the language of a 1904 government official observing rural Irish farmers, as a superstition passed down among the older men. It is not a superstition. What those farmers were doing, without the vocabulary of modern soil science, without any knowledge of fungal biology, without any academic framework whatsoever, was inoculating the root zone of their potato plants with mycorrhizal fungi at the exact moment in the plant's development when its root system was expanding rapidly enough to form productive associations with those networks. Intact meadow sod, particularly sod from undisturbed field margins that have not been tilled or chemically treated, is densely populated with arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, primarily species of the genus Glomus. When that sod is pressed against the root zone of an actively growing plant, the fungal networks colonize the plant's roots and begin forming mycorrhizal associations within 7 to 14 days. Penn State Extension and Wageningen University have both documented that mycorrhizal associations in potato plants increase tuber yields by 12 to 522% in phosphorus-limited soils. Atlantic Irish hillside soils, thin, rocky, repeatedly cropped, were profoundly phosphorus-limited. Those farmers were solving a soil fertility problem that modern science did not identify until the 20th century. Using a technique they had arrived at through observation and inheritance centuries before the mechanism was understood. And here is what matters to you right now. This season, in your garden, you can replicate this exact. If you have access to any undisturbed grassy area, a field margin, a hedgerow base, thick, an unmown corner of your own property, cut palm-sized sections of that sod at first earthing up time and press one against the base of each potato. Plant before mounding. Free, zero cost. Exactly what they did. The mycorrhizal communities in intact, untreated grassland sod are more diverse and more immediately viable than anything you can buy in a packet. If you do not have access to undisturbed sod, use a commercial mycorrhizal inoculant containing Glomus intraradices, the species with the most documented evidence of association with Solanum tuberosum specifically. Apply it as a root dip at planting, coating the seed potato surface before it goes onto the ridge, or top dress it directly into the earthing up soil at the first pass. It will not replicate the full complexity of intact meadow sod, but it will put the right organisms in the right place at the right moment, which is what those Mayo farmers understood before any of us had a word for what they were doing. I have been sitting with that 1904 passage for a long time. If you have ever knelt in your garden in October, digging through a flat bed that should have given you 50 potatoes and finding 20 small ones, split ones that sat in wet soil too long, you now know there was always another way. There still is. Those Irish farmers did not have better seed. In most cases they had worse. They did not have better soil. They were farming Atlantic-facing hillsides on ground that would make a modern raised-bed gardener abandon the project in an afternoon. What they had was a system so precisely calibrated to the relationship between water, soil, temperature, and plant biology that it doubled the output of every alternative available to them. That system was not lost to the famine. It was quietly set aside when industrial agriculture arrived with inputs and equipment and the insistence that traditional knowledge was something to move past. The lazy bed got reframed as desperation, as poverty, as the thing you did when you had nothing. What the evidence shows is that it was the thing you did when you understood something that the industry selling you irrigation equipment would prefer you never learned. You now know what they understood. What part of this system are you going to build first? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. And share this with one person in your life who has given up on growing potatoes after a bad harvest. You are about to prove to them that the failure was never the potato. It was the system built around it. If you are the kind of person who believes that the most effective growing systems are not in the garden centers, that they are in the historical record, in the practices of people who had no margin for error and no choice but to make the land work, then you already know what belongs next. Subscribe to Ancient Roots channel. The next system goes deeper than this one, and it makes this one look like the introduction.